expelled by her cruel stepmother, but the Duke of Otterholme had seen everything and claimed her. I did not speak until I was certain. That is the thing people do not understand about Alaric Vane, Duke of Otterholme. They mistake my silence for indifference, my stillness for vacancy, my patience for weakness. They watch me stand at the edge of a room and conclude I am not paying attention. They are wrong on every count. I am always paying attention. I simply do not act until I am ready to act with finality. I noticed Miss Eleanor Voss at the Casterbridge Assembly in November. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the way quiet women are beautiful when they do not know they are being observed. The line of her profile turned toward the window, the small, unconscious lift of her chin when someone said something she found foolish. I noticed her because of what happened in the corridor outside the card room. Her stepmother, Mrs. Agatha Voss, had backed her against the wall. I was standing in the shadow of the doorway arch, a glass of claret I had not touched in my hand. Mrs. Voss was a handsome woman who had married Eleanor's father 2 years before his death and spent the 18 months since managing his modest estate and Eleanor, with the precision of a woman who had calculated everything and found Eleanor an inconvenience. "You will smile," Mrs. Voss said, in a voice she thought was low enough. "You will not correct Mr. Fenwick again. You will not make anyone at this assembly feel that you are cleverer than they are, and you will stop looking at the Duke." "I was not looking at the Duke," Eleanor said. "Everyone looks at the Duke." "Then perhaps you mean everyone," Eleanor said very evenly. "I was looking at the window." Mrs. Voss's hand tightened on her arm. "You are here by my sufferance. Your father's estate is in my keeping, your allowance is at my discretion, and your position in that house is dependent on my good will. Do you understand me?" Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, ma'am." "I understand you perfectly." She smiled, not the smile Mrs. Voss had commanded, but a quieter one, private, that had nothing to do with the assembly or the company or her stepmother's approval. Then she turned and walked back into the room. I set down my claret untasted and thought, I will need to know more about Miss Voss. I knew more about Miss Voss within a fortnight. She was 23, the only daughter of the late Reverend Thomas Voss of Casterbridge, a scholar and a gentle man who had left his modest library, his smaller modest income, and his wholly immodest daughter in the keeping of a second wife who had never wanted any of them. Eleanor had been educated by her father. Latin, natural philosophy, French, watercolors she cared nothing about, music she played only when she thought no one was listening, and a habit of reading long after the household candles were snuffed by the window light when she could get it. My steward's inquiries among the village tradespeople were thorough. The apothecary's wife said Eleanor had helped set a miller's broken arm when no surgeon could be reached, calm as stone, talking the man through every step. The schoolmaster said she had been teaching 2 of the farmers' children to read, quietly, for 3 years, asking nothing for it. I asked my steward what Mrs. Voss said of her. He hesitated. "She calls her adequate, your grace." "Adequate," I said. "And occasionally tiresome." I thought of Eleanor's face in the corridor, the straight spine, the private smile. I thought of the miller's arm and the farmer's children and the French and the Latin and the long hours by the window. I thought of a woman who had been called adequate and found it evidently not worth her distress. "Adequate," I said again, and let the word sit in the room between us for a moment, and then I asked my steward to look into the exact terms of Reverend Voss's estate. The terms were as I suspected. The estate was held in trust, administered by Mrs. Voss, with Eleanor entitled to a small annual income contingent on remaining in her father's household, which was now her stepmother's household, and to the principal only upon her marriage with her stepmother's approval. It was a neat little trap, dressed as provision. Mrs. Voss could withhold approval indefinitely and had every incentive to do so, since Eleanor's continued presence in the household was the condition of Mrs. Voss's own comfortable management of the estate income. Should Eleanor leave or be dismissed without a suitable marriage, she would lose the contingent income as well. She would have nothing. I sat with this information for 2 weeks. Some men would have acted immediately. Some men would have ridden to the house with a declaration and a ring and the certainty of their own good intentions as sufficient cause. I am not such a man. I have seen enough of the world, enough of the aftermath of impulsive decisions made by men who believed their rank excused them from the obligation of care, to know that good intentions are not the same as wisdom, and that a woman who has spent 3 years navigating carefully around a legal trap deserves to be approached with equivalent care. I had a solicitor examine the trust documents. I had a second solicitor examine the first solicitor's examination. I attended 2 more Casterbridge assemblies, and at both of them I watched Elinor Voss move through a room full of people who looked past her, who stepped around her to reach the refreshment table, who interrupted her mid-sentence, who nodded at her, and then turned toward someone more glittering. And she bore all of it with the same private interior steadiness, like a lamp burning low, and even in a room where everyone was too busy watching the chandelier to notice it. I watched her argue a point about agricultural drainage with the local magistrate and prove, with quiet precision and 3 examples, that he was mistaken. I watched her give her last bite of supper to a young girl who had been overlooked at the table. I watched her once, from across the room, catch the eye of an elderly gentleman who had spilled wine on his coat, and cross to him without being summoned, and say something that made him laugh. I was, by December, as certain as I had ever been of anything. The expulsion happened in January. My steward heard it from the apothecary's wife, who had it from the butcher's boy, who had witnessed the scene from the lane outside the Voss garden gate. Mrs. Agatha Voss had, that morning, informed Elinor that she would be marrying Mr. Clarence Fenwick, a landowner of middling property and considerable self-regard who had made an offer and been encouraged within the month. Elinor had declined. Mrs. Voss had stated that Elinor's continued residence in the house was conditional on compliance. Elinor had said, with great composure, that in that case she supposed she would no longer be residing in the house. She had been given an hour. She had packed 2 trunks and a box of her father's books and been seen walking down the Casterbridge lane in the January cold, her back straight, her face entirely composed, asking the butcher's boy if he knew of anyone who might have a room to let. I heard this at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. I was in Otterholme by 11. By 11:30, I had had a very brief, very clear conversation with my solicitor. By noon, I was riding toward Casterbridge. I found her at the Widow Crane's cottage on the east edge of the village, a single room above a kitchen, clean and cold, with her 2 trunks stacked against the wall and her father's books arranged with great care on the windowsill. The widow had been kind. Elinor was sitting in the single chair by the cold hearth with a shawl around her shoulders and a book open in her lap, and when I knocked on the open door, she looked up with the particular expression of a woman who is declining to be surprised by anything further today. "Your Grace," she said, and began to stand. "Please don't," I said, and she looked at me with a slight narrowing of her eyes that I had come to understand meant she was recalibrating. She sat back down. I remained in the doorway, because the room was small and the situation delicate, and I had not entirely decided on my opening until she said, "I expect you have heard." "I have." "I suppose the whole county has heard." "The whole county will have heard by Thursday," I said. "I came on Tuesday because that seemed preferable." A silence, then she said, "I am not a charity case, Your Grace." "No," I said, "you are not." And I pulled the letter from my coat, the one my solicitor had prepared that morning, and held it out. She took it with steady hands and read it, and I watched her face as she read, which is to say I watched her face go carefully, deliberately still, which is what her face did when it was working very hard. The letter was a formal request from my solicitor to hers. She had, it appeared, no solicitor, but the fiction of one was necessary. That Miss Elinor Voss would consent to receive a formal proposal of marriage from Alaric Vane, Duke of Otterholme, at a time and place of her choosing, and that she should be under no pressure to accept, and that in the event of a refusal the trust provisions of her late father's estate had been examined by 2 independent solicitors, and were, in the enclosed summary, found to be legally contestable on 3 grounds, and that the enclosed summary and the services of any solicitor of her choosing were provided without obligation and required nothing of her in return. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and held it in her lap and said nothing for a moment. "You have been preparing this," she said. "Yes." "For how long?" "Since November." She looked up at that, the assembly. "The corridor outside the card room," I said. "I was in the doorway. I heard what she said to you." A long pause. Outside the widow's small window, the January light came thin and white over the village rooftops. Elinor Voss sat in her single chair with her father's books behind her and the solicitor's letter in her hands, and looked at me with an expression I found difficult to interpret, which was unusual. "You heard all of it," she said. "I heard all of it." "And you said nothing for 2 months." "I was not ready to say something final," I said. "When I am ready to say something final, I say it." Another silence. Then very quietly she said, "What are you saying finally, Your Grace?" I had prepared, as I prepare everything, for this moment. I had the speech. I had the logic. I had the 3 ways of addressing her concern about obligation, and the 2 ways of addressing her concern about charity, and the careful distinction between admiration and pity that I had worked out to my own satisfaction. I had all of it ready. I said none of it. I crossed the small room in 2 steps and went down on one knee on the cold flagstone floor, which is not something I have done for any person in my 40 years of life, and I looked up at Elena Voss and I said, "I would like to marry you if you will have me, not because I pity you. Because you are the most remarkable woman I have ever had the privilege of watching, and because I have watched you long enough to be certain, and because I am tired of standing at the edge of a room pretending I am not looking at you." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I was looking at the window." "I know," I said. "But not always," she said. "No," I said, "not always. We were engaged by Tuesday evening. We were married in March. I have been asked, many times in the years since, whether it troubled me, the talk, the gossip, the society's bright astonishment that the Duke of Otterholme had chosen the expelled, penniless daughter of a country vicar over the half-dozen titled daughters who had been placed in his path that season. I have been asked whether Elena found it difficult, the stares at the London assemblies, the whispers, Mrs. Agatha Voss's mortified and furious face at the Kesterbridge Spring Assembly when we attended together for the first time as husband and wife, Elena in deep blue silk on my arm, the Otterholme diamonds at her throat, perfectly at ease, acknowledging the room with exactly the private interior smile I had first seen in November. I tell them it did not trouble me at all. I had been watching Elena Voss for 4 months before I spoke. I knew precisely what I was choosing and precisely why. The only people in that assembly room who were surprised were the people who had never been paying attention. She knew it. She had known since the doorway on Tuesday morning in the January cold. She had said yes not because I was a duke and she was penniless, but because when I went to one knee on that cold flagstone floor, I looked up at her, and she could see in my face that I had seen her. All of her. The Latin and the natural philosophy and the farmer's children and the miller's arm and the long hours by the window and the private smile and the straight back in the corridor and the 2 months of patience I had spent, doing the hard, invisible work of being certain before I finally spoke. She had been called adequate for 3 years. I told her once what I had thought when my steward reported that word to me. She asked me what I had thought. I said, "I thought whoever called you adequate had not been paying attention." She laughed, the real one, not the assembly laugh, the private one that reaches her eyes. And then she said, "And you, Your Grace, are the only person who has ever paid enough attention to know the difference." I said, "I intend to keep paying attention for a very long time." She looked at me with that expression, the one I understand perfectly now, though it took me until March to name it. It is the expression she wears when she is wholly, entirely seen. She said, "Good."